Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the question that applicants tend to ask really late in the game. Not whether their story sounds good, but whether it actually holds up under the admissions watchful eyes. Many applicants assume this question is answered by outcomes, strong stats, brand name, positive feedback from people around them. But the admission team is not necessarily assessing how you sound in forums. They are assessing how you sound in a pool of applicants who you are competing with. So they're asking whether your story is coherent under pressure, whether it's logical, whether you have showed judgment and decision-making in the various different areas that you are sharing with them. So if you're applying in round 1 or round 2 in the coming cycle, or maybe you are early to the game and want to get a sense of what a good story actually needs to look like, you still have obviously some time to work through that, but structural positioning is something that you want to keep in mind, especially those who are applying in the coming rounds, because by the time we reach application deadlines by September or January or March, if you're applying in round 3, by that point you are really going to be focusing on refining your story rather than reassessing the underlying logic of why you've chosen to communicate what you have chosen to communicate. So this session today is about how admission committees evaluate stories and why self-confidence is often the least reliable indicator of whether a narrative is actually working. I am sure you have read Reddit posts of exceptional candidates that get rejected. This is what we're talking about. Many strong candidates feel ready because their background is strong, but the problem is that readiness isn't something you feel. It's something that is going to be demonstrated and, for lack of a better word, scrutinized by the admission committee while they're reviewing your candidacy. So let's dive right in. And for those who are watching, I encourage you to engage with us, write any comments along the way in the chat. I will be addressing them later down the line. And, like this video if you find this content valuable to your positioning and your story development. The statement that I oftentimes hear is, if my experience is strong, the story should work. This is the default mental model, especially among high performers. The assumption is that you've made the right moves, you progress logically, and achieve strong outcomes. So as long as you explain that experience clearly, admission will see that as well. What's often overlooked is that strong experiences does not create a benefit of the doubt. It actually removes it. The more impressive someone's background is, the more you are going to be, the more high caliber expectation of quality is going to be there. So your reasoning, your intent, your judgment, all of that will be assessed by the admission committee. And many rejections happen not because the experience is weak, but because the story doesn't convincingly explain why those experiences led to the decisions the candidate made and how those experiences are valuable to an MBA classroom that others can learn in your company, from you in your company. The assessment problem is that you are human, and as such, you are biased by your own experiences. You have your own internal logic in terms of why you made the decisions that you've made, that oftentimes you don't necessarily always think about explaining them, or they may seem self-explanatory to you because you have all the data points. You know why you made each moves, you know what you were optimizing for, you know what felt strategic at the time that you were making the decisions. Admission teams, you have to remember that they do not have that context. They don't know you. All they know is what you present in front of them. So that means they infer intent from patterns, what you've omitted, and how you are framing your experiences. What may feel obvious to you, often it's assumed, or the reader has to assume, and you don't know exactly if they're going to assume what you intended versus what they may see in the context of the pattern you're sharing. What may feel to you strategic may actually read reactive, and you have to explain it. What feels maybe to you differentiated can read really generic to an admission committee who sees other applicants from similar backgrounds to you. This is why oftentimes outcome feels surprising to high caliber candidates, to strong candidates, is because the story they thought was self-evident was never fully visible on the pages that they have submitted for the admission or for the reader. I see this constantly. A candidate describes a move from banking to corporate development as a strategic pivot towards operations role. To them, that logic is obvious. But to the admission team is going to read as lateral movement unless the essay explains what changed in how they thought, what capabilities they were building, or why the move was necessary to build towards a goal that they were pursuing. So that gap between your intention and the interpretation of the reader is where strong applicants oftentimes fail in their application, because they're not really thinking about who and what that context is going to be read as. And this leads directly into what admission is actually evaluating, which is going to be important for you to keep in mind as you develop your stories. So admission teams are not evaluating your resume as a list of accomplishments. And I say this because I see applicants that come to us as reapplicants, and I look at their resume, and the first thing I notice is a list of accomplishments. The admission team is evaluating evidence of your judgment. Every decision on your resume is treated as decision points, not just about what you did, but how you decided, why you moved when you did, what you understood at each inflection point, and what outcome all of those, the accumulation of all those decisions led towards. So if you think about outcome alone does not really communicate your thinking versus integrating your decision making along the way, it really communicates who you are as a character. And again, this is a lot of times when strong candidates misunderstand the process of the MBA application or the process of the storytelling in the MBA application. They assume the admission team is primarily assessing capabilities, intelligence, did you execute, do you have leadership potential? Yes, those may be true, but in reality, the admission team is assessing whether they can trust your decision making. How do you go about making your decisions? What are you saying yes and what you're saying no to? Now, this does not necessarily go yes, the yeses and nos does not necessarily go in your resume, but the accumulation of all the various different stories that they ask of you helps them determine those details. Even if we take a lateral move, that can be interpreted in two different ways. One, framing can suggest that there was a strategic risk-taking in service of a longer-term goal, and another can suggest a drift, impatience, or optimism, or opportunism rather than optimism. The difference isn't in the move itself, because obviously you can't go back and change what you have decided. It's whether you as a candidate can explain the decisions to the admission team with a lot of clarity around how thoughtful and purposeful you were, by communicating clearly, by communicating that you are someone who is extremely self-aware. The same is true for promotions. Title change does not necessarily mean that you are growing. Admission is going to be looking at, yes, you got a title change, but what has this change resulted in the context of your progression? Did you get greater scope? Did your judgment expand? Did the consequences of your decisions increase? Were you operating with a lot more ambiguity than before? So it's not the title itself, it's the scope of the work that you're doing that is going to make a greater move. And when the admission team reads your application, they're effectively stress testing your reasoning. They're assessing whether your explanation feels grounded in real trade-offs, real uncertainty, and real learning, because there is a reason why they want you to have about 5 years of work experience. You are making career moves and you're further down the line of clarifying where it is that you want to go. So this is why oftentimes two candidates with very similar resumes can receive completely different outcomes. One demonstrates judgment through how they frame the decision, and the other assumes the resume speaks for itself. Admission teams are not going to reward assumptions, especially when they're putting together a class of individuals who are coming from a variety of different backgrounds. You assuming that someone is going to understand your background is also assuming that they're in the same space that you are, which the admission team is assessing. Are you going to be able to communicate with other individuals who are in different spaces than you are, and that you can communicate effectively in a way that they can understand? Now, let's talk about where oftentimes strong candidates get trapped. And I think this is oftentimes something that we see now with AI and the use of AI. The expectation is, of course, your material is going to be much more polished than it would have if you had written every single word. You have, used your own judgment without necessarily relying on that. So with this, you are oftentimes candidates assume that because now the story flows, that there is no friction from the reader's perspective, that there's no ambiguity that the reader is left wondering around. And sometimes when you read an essay, or when I read an essay, I will say there's nothing necessarily structurally wrong, but that is where the trap lies. It's difficult for the strong candidate to detect that there is nothing wrong with your story, but there's something missing in your story at the same time. So a polished story can feel completely strong, right? But still leaving the most important question unanswered. And the admission team are not really rejecting these applicants because something is necessarily broken. They're rejecting them because nothing necessarily resolved their doubt. Nothing necessarily told them that you are a strong candidate that they want in their classroom to make up a very diverse thinking kind of community that they are known for, right? Because they themselves are also bringing people who match the culture that they have painstakingly created over a number of years. This shows up in most clearly in goals that sound plausible but aren't grounded in necessarily in evidence. I hear a lot of candidates speaking to friends, speaking to a variety of different individuals who talk about goals that are plausible, but when we stress test it from the perspective of the admission team, it's not necessarily giving them the reassurance that they will have a job by the time they graduate. It also shows up in leadership stories that describe responsibility without necessarily any consequences. So everything worked out perfectly. Candidates explain what they led, who they managed, what they delivered, but there was no actual challenge to resolve in the context of the work that you are presenting. Decisions necessarily aren't altered because of any friction. Nothing necessarily changed. Nothing shows that you are someone who was going to be able to make important decision when things break down. Progression can also equally be deceptive. So I was promoted numerous times. I've had clients that, had 5 promotions in 5 years, almost perfect GMAT test, and still got rejected. This means that, sometimes you can have a sequence of roles that may make sense chronologically, but can still not make much sense in the context of your intentionality and why you were making the decisions you were making. The reader is going to understand what happened, but not why did you make the decisions that you've made. What makes polished applications particularly vulnerable is that they rarely trigger immediate skepticism. Again, they sound fine. They sound like nothing's wrong with them. But the admission team may not necessarily see a red flag, but they're definitely going to see a lack of conviction. The story feels reasonable, but not something that when you have more candidates than there are seats to fill, you're not really left wanting to necessarily move the needle with this person's candidacy, just because it is plain, for lack of a better word. So when you rely too much on making sure that your essays and your application looks extremely polished, it can really be a detriment to your story. It creates confidence for you without necessarily pressure testing the validity of the story. It definitely encourages applicants to think that their story is finished, when in reality it hasn't necessarily answered a lot of the fundamental questions that the admission team, who is trained to evaluate and assess candidates, is looking for in their application. So this shows up very clearly in how strong candidates can definitely lose leverage in the context of their narrative. These are definitely not mistakes of someone who is extremely strong as a candidate, but they can be interpretive gaps that strong candidates often assume that the logic is there, and when they speak about it, it makes a lot of sense, but that conviction may not necessarily translate on the page. And if you can't translate it on the page, it's not going to necessarily entice someone to invite you to interview. The admission team is evaluating whether you have reflected on why each move matters to you and how it shaped your perspective in terms of your growth and your learning over time. Obviously, the person you were when you graduated college should not be the same person you are today. You have evolved because of the experiences that you've had, and your job is to communicate that in your application effectively. Leadership oftentimes can break down similarly. Many candidates describe scope. That can mean team management or intern management, projects delivered, stakeholder influence. And admission teams are not just looking for cataloged responsibilities. They're looking for evidence that you have made, again, the right judgments and the right calls. What changed because you were there? That is a question you should write down as you're assessing your your application and your writing and your copy, essentially, that you are including in there. How did your present and your thinking alter decisions, priorities, or even outcomes in the work that you were exposed to up to date? Goals also tend to be directionally sound, but underdeveloped oftentimes, or overly ambitious other times, where it is really difficult for the admission team to see how your past experience will allow you rather to be able to succeed in the future goals. So wanting to move into a new space is definitely not an issue. The issue is whether there is visible preparation, visible transferable skills, signals that allow the admission team to understand that the gaps that you have in your professional development can be filled by an MBA, and that will enable you to get closer to your goals. That you'll be able to get to the short-term goal as well as get closer to the long-term plan. When these elements are left implicit or underdeveloped, admission teams are not going to assume that you are there. They will assume that you are not necessarily, or you have not necessarily done the prerequisite legwork necessary for you to know why you want an MBA, why you want an MBA from this school, and why is now the right time for you to be there, which in effect diminishes, or you essentially lose a lot of the leverage that you have from your experiences. So when candidates sense something is off, their instinct is usually to gather more feedback. So on the surface, that obviously feels quite rational. The issue, however, isn't the volume of feedback, it's the lens through which that feedback is coming from. So most feedback is going to be looking at helping you gain more confidence. So friends assess whether the stories sound logical, mentors respond to whether it feels compelling, editors focus on clarity and polish. Online forums are going to compare you to the narrative of other people that they have seen, or even their own experiences, but not against the admission criteria of the schools that you're targeting. And none of these perspectives are wrong, of course not, but none of them are really answering the question the admission team is asking. The admission team is assembling a class that is what they want and what they think that the future is going to need to look like. So they're reading applications side by side, looking at candidates with similar employers, similar backgrounds, similar roles, and similar trajectories. What differentiates those candidates is rarely the title or the project or the dollar amount that they worked on in terms of the project scope. It's how they interpret experience that is going to differentiate you from the next consultant who is 2 cubicles down from you, or from the next investment banker who is, in the other side of the floor. They are really looking at how you think and how your thinking has evolved over time. 2 people can sit, again, a few cubicles away, or apart rather, work in similar initiatives and emerge with different perspectives. Admission is looking for that difference. That's where your job is, to make sure that you're communicating your story in a way that is not going to sound like your colleague who's also applying to business school. Strong stories make that distinction visible without necessarily forcing it. Whereas the weaker stories, or the ones who are relying necessarily solely on polish, are going to really look at that surface level. Does it sound good? And I'm going to submit this. So this is where your interpretation becomes more important than, or rather the interpretation of the stories that you're including becomes more important in the context of the outcome of your programs that you apply to. So admission decisions aren't necessarily driven by I'm catching your mistakes or dismantling your story. They're there to really wanting to say yes to you, so long as you give them the reason why they should say yes to you. They are driven by understanding how you think, what they're going to learn from you, and what the community is going to learn from you, and how are you going to contribute to the broader class. And that doesn't mean just the classroom itself, but even the broader community itself. So when the admission team reads an application, they're not evaluating it in isolation. They're reading it alongside dozens, sometimes hundreds of candidates with overlapping backgrounds, similar employers, and comparable roles. So this is where you making sure that you have clarity in your application is really going to matter. A vague transition doesn't necessarily raise suspicion because it's wrong. It raises really the question because it suggests that the candidate hadn't fully reflected on why that move mattered to them and their career. How has that experience changed the perspective of the candidate, and as a result can bring added value to the classroom discussion. Similarly, if you overinflate your claims, doesn't necessarily fail because it's bold, but it fails because it lacks really grounding, and the admission team is very much grounded in reality. It doesn't help them understand how your experiences differentiate from other candidates who have similar titles, similar backgrounds to you. They are assessing credibility as well, in that if it's overly ambitiously described, it will come into question. Your honesty will come into question. The admission team is really looking for a range of perspectives, decision-making styles, and ways of interpreting experiences. If multiple candidates describe similar roles, projects, or trajectories, the differentiator becomes how these experiences are understood and articulated for the admission team. I'm sure you have seen, two people describe the same incident in very different ways, and your attention is always going to be with the person who is able to give you more detail to capture your imagination as you're telling the story. Not that you are making up stories, of course, here, but the storytelling is an important element in your application. Strong stories are going to make your transferable skills, your ability to add value, easier. They help the admission team see just what you did, as well as how you think about experiences. What did you notice? What were the questions that you have? And how has your thinking evolved over time because of the experiences that you have had? When the clarity becomes very evident, the application feels distinct from others who have similar backgrounds to you, without necessarily coming across as inauthentic in the context of your story. But when that clarity is absent, the reader is left to infer differentiation, and they, to be honest, don't really have time to do that. They will read what you have at face value and be ready to move on. What ultimately changes outcomes is not necessarily better execution, but it's really the earlier understanding of your positioning and your story. Until you know how your story is being interpreted, especially when you're comparing to others who are also applying with similar background, starting writing any of your material is really premature. You are refining language when the foundation is not stable, is not the best use of your time. The strongest candidates are going to assess early. They identify whether their stories blend in, whether their thinking isn't fully visible, and whether differentiation needs to be clarified early on. From there, once you have that, narrative lined up, the writing becomes so much easier. And knowing how your story is being interpreted obviously comes with diagnosis. Getting the right diagnosis in terms of like where you are strong, where you need to develop, what you need to pay attention to, it's definitely going to remove a lot of uncertainty. That will help you along the line to make sure that you are not wasting your time, given that all of you have full-time jobs. Most of you are preparing for tests, and putting together strong applications does require significant effort, and doing this process early will definitely benefit you. If an external perspective would be helpful, one that looks at your story the way that we've seen how admission teams are evaluating candidates, you can definitely book a consultation to discuss, or you can request a profile evaluation. Both links are in the description of this live. The profile evaluation allows me to actually look at your strengths, your weaknesses, areas to pay close attention to. So at least you can have that preliminary assessment. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, we will be monitoring the replay. If there are questions that you have and you're watching this offline, off the live, please write your questions in the comments, and we will try our best to respond to those in a timely manner, so that you can have some answers in the context of the presentation itself. All right. Well, thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.